suppose to start off, you should introduce your lovely self and the book we're going to be talking about today. Look at that foiling.
Right. Hello, I'm Frances Hardinge, and this is my latest book, Unraveller.
Yeah. So could you give us a little bit of an insight in what people could expect from the book for those who might not have heard of it yet or are interested in picking it up?
Certainly. This is a sort of dark adventure, mystery, fantasy story set in an alternative world and involving curses and consequences. It's set in an imaginary country called Radith. And Radith, at first glance, looks like a fairly common sense sort of place until you notice a couple of little quirks. One quirk is that along the coast, there's a narrow strip of misty, marshy woods, which are actually a lot larger than they look from the outside. And they're a place of dark dreams and strange creatures, and they're extremely dangerous. The other quirk of Radith is that anybody in that country who is consumed by anger or hatred or pain can develop the ability to curse their enemy, a magical curse that may trap or transform them. And these curses are mostly incurable, except that there is one solitary person who can lift curses.
It's an absolutely fantastic book. When I first heard of it, the idea of curses and their consequences, just those two elements instantly had me hooked, and I knew I had to read it. So obviously, as you've mentioned, at its heart, it is about curses and their consequences and kind of the aftermath of having cursed someone or having been cursed. What kind of drew you to explore that element? Because that's kind of where usually stories would end. The curse has been lifted and everyone's happily ever after. But obviously this book goes into more of the aftermath and the realities that might arise from being put in that situation on either side.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's because those are the parts of the story that we don't usually get to see. That was one of the main draws for me. Whenever I was reading fairy tales or folklore where there's a curse or an enchantment or whatever, as you say, usually the point where those get lifted at the end of the story. But I'm always interested in the parts of stories that are sort of swept under the carpet of the happy ending. And I look at these people who have spent a long time as a footstool or a dog or something, thinking, are they just going to go back to normal now? They're just going to be fine, are they? And I'm also interested in the cursors, the people who have this well of hatred or rage or malice, sometimes seeming quite irrational. And I'm curious to know where that comes from. I want to know what happened to those people before the story even started.
Definitely. It's something, even as a kid, I can always recall wondering about. Beauty and the Beast was a great one for me, because after all that time as a teapot, how are you just going to start going around dancing? You've been a teapot for ages, you've not had legs. Would you instantly know how to spin around and do a fancy dance on the spot? So it was a really interesting part of the book. Obviously we've got kind of two main characters and they're quite opposite to each other. I think I can say. So we've got our Unraveller, who can obviously unravel curses. He's slightly quick to anger occasionally, and we have Nettle on the other side, who has been cursed and has been fixed. Her curse has been unraveled, and she is much more of the kind of emotional, thoughtful side of the duo, I think. Were they always going to be such opposite characters in your mind? Do you think that the fact that obviously they have their alliance and their friends, but they've got that little bit of conflict as well. Do you think that was always going to be part of the narrative? And do you think that's why the book works so well?
Yes, I always did see them as having very different perspectives, which is why the perspective of the book, the point of view of the book, is divided between them. And as you say, Nettle is a bit more thoughtful, whereas Kellen, bless him, he does mean well, but he's a bit of a firecracker. Very short fuse, very big mouth. So yes, from the very start, I wanted that difference, and that was quite an interesting and fun challenge.
Definitely. How difficult is it to get into two? Obviously, the book's divided between the two of them. How difficult is it to get into two such opposite views, and be able to kind of balance the two throughout the book, but still have them very clearly opposite at the same time, if that makes sense?
It wasn't too hard on the whole. I mean, there were one or two points where I realized that a particular scene or set of events had to be written from, well, I'd written it from one character's point of view and I had to switch it to a different character's point of view instead, which I had to completely rewrite it because their perspectives were so different. So that was a little more challenging, but I didn't mind it too much. One thing that was more of a challenge, and I'm going to be very oblique about this to avoid spoilers, was writing from the point of view of one of the two without giving away certain things. And you probably know the things I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say any more about them now. I'm going to be mysterious.
Yeah, I do. Like, I always think that that's such an interesting thing as a writer. Obviously, you know things because you're creating this narrative and this journey, and you're often dropping little hints for us to follow along the way. How do you manage to do that in a way that you're not giving too much away too early? Is it just practice, or is, as you're going along, does the story kind of like lend itself to those drops of slight bits of information without giving too much away?
It's a matter of practice and planning. I do have to decide in advance where I'm putting in my clues, my revelations, and of course my red herrings, and where I will hide a clue that looks like one thing but is actually something else in plain sight, so it will be remembered but not interpreted correctly. That's one of the fun things. No, I do need to plan all of that out in advance. As for learning not to give away too much too early, I actually had to learn the opposite. I had to I mean, I and originally used to feel that I was being far too blatant and making clues far too clear and was far too subtle about it. I've had to learn to be a bit less subtle and make my my clues a little easier to catch.
With the book, obviously we've talked about opposites a little bit already. There's another opposite in the book, and that is kind of the human part of your world and the wilds, which are very different from each other. I'd wonder if you want to go into a little bit about the main kind of differences between these two worlds, because I think whilst obviously they're the same world, I think the differences and the opposites between them are really interesting.
Yes, I mean the human population of Radith, the human government and society of Radith, on the one hand, it's somewhere that's sort of reacting against the fact that it's got this, well, you know, quite creepy set of marsh woods along its border, but is very much influenced by that fact. So it's actually governed not by a king or a parliament, but by a big league of nobles, and that was partly because a big league of merchants, and that was partly because when you have basically a fey realm on the edge of on the edge of a country, that can really badly affect your economy. You get really scared to trade, because if someone turns out that you don't know, you can't be sure that anything they sell you won't turn into sand with the rising of the sun, or try to eat you in the middle of the night, and that messes with trade. So you have these merchants who started coming up with some defenses, like steel coins that supernatural beings wouldn't be able to handle, and ways of checking goods, and insignia to show that certain peddlers were safe. And then this is kind of gradually built out to people developing practical measures for living on the edge of this terrifying dreamscape. And in many respects, they're quite practical and hard-headed about it, rather than just sort of quivering in their cottages like Transylvanian villagers in a film about Dracula. I thought it'd be rather more interesting if, instead of them shambling around in superstitious awe, they were just actually being quite level-headed and pragmatic about the whole thing.
Definitely. You definitely get the sense that they're like, right, so there's this wood and marshland over there. It's giving off some vibes. What can we do to kind of like combat it and manage ourselves? Because we can't get rid of it. It's there. We're going to have to find a way to deal with it. And I really like that it was just a kind of, it's there, so how are we going to deal with it? Manage with its existence being there.
They did try to get rid of it. That did not go well.
No.
And the human population ended up making a pact with the wilds, a sort of non-aggression pact, not trespassing too much on each other's territory, an idea of what was breaking the other side's rules and what wasn't, and so forth. And this has mostly held. But that is something that both sides do have in common. Both sides make bargains, because one side are basically dangerous fae who are known for their bargains, and the other side's a load of merchants. So they do have some things in common.
Definitely. You've got the kind of bargains and deals, and then you've got the things that you have to be possibly even more careful with with the wilds and their kind of like bargains, and you've got to make sure you're saying the right thing at the right time.
Yes, words matter a lot.
Yes, definitely. After this book, I was like, I had that moment of like, it reminded me of the power of words. I mean, realistically, I know that in my household, fingers crossed, there are no fae in which to hear my words, but it does remind you of kind of like the overall power of words, which is always, I love words.
Yes.
One of the only creatures that kind of originate from the wilds and the marshlands and kind of venture into the more human side are the little brothers, which are, I have many feelings, particularly because they're very spider-like.
They are. And I am a semi-retired arachnophobe. I'm not as bad as I used to be, but I am still nervous about. I could put a glass over them, but picking it up in my hands is not going to happen. So yes, I also have feelings about spiders, and I perversely, that's probably one of the reasons why I made the little brothers spider-like. But of course, these are the creatures that will approach people that are consumed by rage or hatred, and bestow curses on, the ability to curse on. They think they're giving them a gift. They think they're helping. They think they've found somebody who's been terribly wronged and has given them the means by which to level the playing field. They're not very good at people.
Yeah, I really loved that element of it, that like they meant so well. They meant so well. You realize that they honestly thought, like, look, I'm helping. This will help. You feel wronged. I'm giving you the power to like justice, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
But bless them, they're not the best with people skills.
No, no.
Why is it, do you think, that the little brothers worked so well at being able? What do you think it is about them that made them so kind of able to kind of venture into the human world and see these people who felt really wronged and upset or angry? Because they're the only ones that really venture too far away and kind of have more dominion over the humans.
Yeah, they've got a bit of a loophole in the pact, and I strongly suspect that they argued strongly for that because they want to be able to protect makers. That is the other thing that they do. They are very protective over artisans, makers, creators, and in particular weavers, because obviously they feel quite a lot of fellow feeling towards weavers, other people who play with threads.
Definitely. I've loved all the kind of weaving. Obviously, we have an Unraveller, so then to have the little brothers with their weaving, it was one of those moments that your brain just like lights up with joy because it like all comes.
Well, that was the other reason why spider-like creatures seemed appropriate, because I knew that I wanted a curse to be something that had to be unraveled, not dissected, not purely solved, not cut through, but untangled. And a curse is partly a massive tangle of human emotion, and human emotions are tangled and messy and complicated and intertwined, so that seemed more appropriate.
Definitely. It was one of the elements I most liked about the kind of fixing of curses, in that usually it is a magic potion or, you know, true love's kiss, or, you know, the right words said, like abracadabra. But this was very much the curses have come from human kind of emotions and thoughts, and you kind of have to use an understanding of those to fix the problem.
Yeah, indeed.
Which is a lot more like, you know, how it is in the world.
Yes, indeed. And I thought that seemed a bit more interesting anyway.
Definitely. It's definitely a lot more interesting than someone just showing up with the right magic potion and like pouring it over someone's head and going, da-da!
Yes. Kill the dragon, got the potion, they are fixed.
Yeah, everything's fine now.
Yes.
Don't worry about it. Obviously, with curses being such a big part of the novel, we meet many a person who has been cursed. And that makes me wonder where all the ideas for these different curses came from, because some of them are just, the worm was just a genius.
Oh yes, the poor worm. I'm not nice to some of my characters.
No, you're not. But I was wondering where those like little bits of inspiration came from, because there are so many different curses obviously within the book, and we meet so many people that have been cursed in different ways, that I don't think I'm imaginative enough to come up with that many different ways to curse people.
Well, so, some of them are inspired by folklore. So folklore, old ballads, old fairy tales, and that sort of thing. The backstory of Nettle, who spent 3 years as a heron and who was cursed at the same time as her siblings, that is based heavily on Wild Swans, a literary fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, which in turn was obviously strongly influenced by the old legend of the Children of Lear. And so that I was always fascinated by wild swans, because 11 brothers are cursed to become swans by their stepmother. She doesn't curse her stepdaughter, who then sets about trying to lift the curse and discovers she can only do this by knitting them shirts out of nettles, and that she's not allowed to speak until this is finished. And the king falls in love with her and wants to marry her. Then she gets accused of being a witch and is nearly burnt at the stake, but manages to mostly finish the shirts at the last moment, chucks them down on the swans as they fly down. They're all changed back, except for the youngest brother, whose shirt isn't quite finished, so he still has a swan wing. And then they're able to explain, and she's able to explain, and the king welcomes her into his arms, happy ending. And I always read this and thought, I have some questions. First of all, I'm not convinced that the heroine's marriage has a rock solid foundation there. He was quite happy to burn her about 5 minutes ago. And
not the best start to a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And second, I always wondered about that poor brother with the swan wing. I mean, is he's just stuck with it now, is he? And the others, I mean, are they okay? How could they be? So that very strongly influenced Nettle's background. Of course, in her case, she and her 3 siblings were turned into different birds, which was not good, given that some of those were not terribly compatible. A hawk finding itself in the proximity of a dove. Well, there were some very regrettable and somewhat predictable consequences really rather quickly. Yeah, I as I say, I am not very nice to my character.
No.
And Tansy's curse, the fact that she was cut apart and transformed into a harp, that's actually taken from an old ballad called Two Sisters. I mean, there are lots of different versions of this ballad, and it has different names, but the basic story in some of the versions is that an older sister kills a younger one by drowning out of jealousy, because they're both interested in the same man. And then somebody comes across the drowned corpse of this beautiful young woman and decides to make a harp out of her, as you do, using her bones and stringing it with her golden hair.
What else would you do in that situation?
Yes, absolutely. And in some versions, he then turns up to the wedding of the older sister and the man who was the bone of contention. And when he plays the harp, everyone can hear a voice telling them exactly what happened to her younger sister.
It's one way to crash a wedding, I suppose.
Yes.
How would you see my brain just goes to one, there's a couple of things. Why would you make a harp? Why would you take it to the wedding? Unless you I'm guessing you knew what was, but then also, how do you explain that when in the midst of your wedding that you've murdered your sister and apparently she's now a harp? There's a lot of explaining to do in that one. I think that would be some of the most interesting part of that story, just the conversations that happened from the events.
I mean, wouldn't you hate to be the wedding planner?
Oh man.
You think you prepared for everything, and this happens, and you're basically in the door saying, "Everyone through for canapes."
What can I do in this situation? There's
Yes.
nothing. There's no there's nothing you could do to fix if you were a wedding planner. That I think if it was me, I'd just kind of see it happening drop whatever I was doing and just walk out the back door and leave them to
Yes,
it.
maybe grab a bottle of wine out of an ice bucket as you go.
Definitely. So I'd love to know, I always think it's really interesting, other than obviously enjoyment from reading it, is there anything else that you hope that readers would take away from reading The Unraveller?
Well, what I always say is that I'd like them to enjoy it. I'd like them to find it exciting. I'd like them to find it fun. I'd like them to be frightened by some of it, ideally. But I guess I'd also like anybody who's maybe not finding it easy to be as fine as they think they ought to be, to know that that is okay, that is normal, and that they should cut themselves some slack.
Definitely. I think it's, especially in today's world, it's very easy to think that you're not as the best you could be and everyone else is already at that stage, when in reality I've not met a single person who thinks they've got it all together. Yeah, I definitely, you've managed all those things and more. This book, parts of this book that, like, the image of the marsh horses, terrifying.
Yay!
Absolutely terrifying. Like, I love it, but also no, don't
Well,
want to be near one in real life.
of course, they're partly inspired by kelpies, as you probably guessed.
Terrifying.
Sorry? Oh, jolly good.
Just, I really did like, though, the relationship between kind of the masked horses and their one person, and that kind of weird power dynamic between the two, and that the power that they both then have together. Terrifying, but very interesting.
Excellent.
What about, was there something about kind of kelpies in general that kind of you knew that you were going to draw upon something like that to bring it into the book?
Well, I was drawing quite a lot on folklore, and the nice thing about creating marshwoods is I get to draw on folkloric creatures that are associated with the kind of the fairy tale forests, but also the creatures of marshland. You know, the sort of various kinds of ginny lanterns and will-o'-the-wisps, and creatures that might lurk underneath bogs and treacherous land and in water. So it gives me a lot to choose from. In terms of kelpies, they would generally be a rather beautiful horse that you might come across trotting alone by itself, and be very friendly, and you kind of get the feeling that it wants you to go on its back and like pet it, and its mane would probably be wet, and that would be a bit of a warning. But if you ignored that warning and climbed on its back, it would gallop with you and jump into deep water and then devour you, except for your heart. So don't do that. But there was this other saying that you could tame a kelpie if you managed to get a bridle on it. And I thought, well, that is an interesting idea. But wouldn't it be much more interesting if you had to go to an extremely perilous moonlit market where the land meets the sea and trade a single eye in order to be pacted forever to this creature? I thought that seemed more interesting.
Definitely terrifying, because like it begs the question, who would trade an eye? I mean, there's power there, but terrifying.
Yes, if you make that trade, you are never quite the same afterwards. You're a little grayer, a little stranger, a little more wild. than you were before. And the answer to who would make that trade is generally desperate people.
Yeah.
Because there are rich and powerful people who quite fancy the idea of having a marsh horse to pull their carriage and don't really fancy the idea of giving up one of their eyes.
Which you can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And therefore are willing to find someone who's desperate and pay them a lot of money or get them out of a jam in order to get them to pay the eye. The catch being that the horse does not consider itself to belong to the rich person. The horse considers itself to belong to the one-eyed person to whom it is pacted, and whom the rich person had probably better employ.
Yeah, definitely. I really liked the kind of power dynamic that comes from that, because the rich person almost loses their power in that situation unless they continue to provide reasoning, which some do in not very nice ways. They kind of lose a bit of that power because the horse and its owner, friend, partner, they kind of have the power, whereas the horse ain't gonna listen to you, no matter how much money you kind of wave at it, which is always an interesting power dynamic.
You are not going to be able to bribe it with high quality hay.
No.
Not least because a marsh horse is not herbivorous.
No. Another terrifying element of it. If I ever see a horse anywhere near a marsh, I don't think I'll be able to look at it the same way after reading this book. So
my work here is done.
So just know that if I ever see a horse, I'm going to be looking at it twice from now on, especially if it's near a centimetre of water. It could be near a muddy puddle at this point, and I'll be looking at it twice, because I think the scene that got it was that through the marsh itself and just like disappearing and then just popping. No.
Excellent.
And I mean, when I was a stereotypical little girl. I always wanted a horse when I was very tiny, and now I'm partially glad I don't have one.
Well, you know, one trip to the seaside and the loss of an eye, and it could be yours forever.
Oh, that's it. Oh, oh, in the best way, it is a feeling.
That's what I go for. Thank you very much.
So I'd love to know if there's any books that you think are really worth picking up, any that you'd love to recommend before we go.
Ooh, well, the one that I've just been reading is Her Dark Wings by Melinda Salisbury, which actually it's got some things in common with Unraveller in that it's also drawing on legend. They're in this case Greek legend, and it's also about rage and recovery, and it's an interesting retelling of Persephone.
Yeah,
and I very much enjoyed it.
I it's one of the kind of retellings, I suppose, that I've enjoyed the most, just because it was such a different take on it to what I'd seen before. So that's it. I fully agree with that recommendation. That's a great book. So I suppose I will say goodbye to you for today, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.